Did Neanderthals really disappear, or do they still live within us today? It's a question that sounds simple, yet the answer reshapes everything we think we know about human evolution. For generations, we were taught that Neanderthals were an ancient species that lost the battle for survival, outsmarted and outlived by Homo sapiens. But new science tells a very different story, one where extinction and survival are not opposites, but partners in the same evolutionary dance. In evolution, not every ending is final. Sometimes a species fades not because it dies, but because it merges. Scientists call this process introgressive extinction, when two once separate species come together again until their differences dissolve. It's the paradox of nature, disappearance through union, and nowhere is this paradox more haunting or more human than in the story of Neanderthals. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors and the Neanderthals crossed paths again and again, sometimes fighting, sometimes sharing fire, sometimes even sharing blood. The traces of those encounters are still inside us today, written quietly into our DNA. Every person alive who descends from outside Africa carries fragments of Neanderthal genes, a biological whisper from a vanished world. This is not just a story about ancient bones. It's a mirror one that reflects who we are and how fragile survival can be. Because what happened to Neanderthals isn't only history, it's a warning. If extinction can come through change as much as through destruction, then perhaps the question isn't what killed them, but what we might be becoming next. Our story begins 600,000 years ago, in a world colder, harsher, and far older than our imagination can reach. Across the wind-swept plains of Ice Age Europe, a new kind of hominin appeared, creatures with large brains, strong hands, and eyes that already held a spark of understanding. They carried stone tools shaped with precision, the Acheulean blades that first carved out humanity's early footprint. Archaeologists believe they came from Africa, waves of ancient travelers driven by hunger, curiosity, or perhaps a silent instinct to move forward. We call them archaic Homo sapiens, or sometimes Homo heidelbergensis, names that try to capture beings who were both like us and not quite us. These early humans are mysterious shadows in our past. Some scientists think they were the ancestors of both Neanderthals and modern humans. Others believe they were only the roots of Neanderthals, a side branch that split from our own line long before history began. And there's a third possibility that they were an evolutionary dead end, a forgotten experiment of nature lost to time. Whatever the truth, this was the beginning of a long divergence, a slow unfolding of two destinies that would one day meet again. From those early migrations, the Neanderthals evolved in Europe and Western Asia, shaped by freezing winters, scarce food, and endless cycles of ice and thaw. In the warm plains of Africa, another lineage, our lineage continued to grow and change. We were learning to think in symbols, to build tools from bone and fire, to tell stories with our hands and our eyes. Two branches of the same family tree growing in opposite directions, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of millennia. And yet, destiny was waiting. Because the world would change again, climates would shift, migrations would begin anew, and paths that once diverged would soon cross. As glaciers retreated and continents breathed, these two kinds of humans, born of the same ancient spark, would find each other once more. What happened when they did would forever alter the meaning of what it is to be human. As time passed, the ice advanced and retreated like a living tide, reshaping the continents and driving migrations that would bring the two human worlds face to face. Around 60,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens began their long journey out of Africa. They crossed deserts, followed rivers, and wandered into lands already inhabited by another kind of human, the Neanderthals. What happened next wasn't a single meeting, but a long, tangled web of encounters that stretched across tens of thousands of years. Sometimes these meetings may have ended in fear or violence, two species protecting what they believed was theirs. But other times, something far more intimate occurred. Around 47,000 years ago, our ancestors and Neanderthals began interbreeding. It wasn't a brief episode. The genetic evidence shows that this contact lasted nearly 7,000 years. And even earlier, perhaps as far back as 140,000 years ago, in the caves of what is now Israel, a child was born who carried features of both lineages, a living bridge between two worlds. These were not isolated events. Modern DNA analysis reveals that humans and Neanderthals met and mingled multiple times, in different places and different eras, leaving traces of those unions scattered across Eurasia. When scientists map our genomes today, they find pieces of Neanderthal DNA still woven through our own small fragments of an ancient love story, written not in words but in molecules. The boundaries between us and them were never as solid as we once imagined. Through thousands of quiet interactions, shared fires, shared hunts, perhaps shared affections, the lines blurred. This process, known as reverse speciation, is nature's paradox. Two distinct species coming together again until their differences dissolve. Yet this merging didn't create a completely new species. Instead, it reshaped both, leaving behind a version of humanity that carried whispers of both lineages. When we speak of evolution, we often picture progress, one species replacing another. But in reality, it was closer to fusion, a long dance of meeting, mixing, and becoming. In those frozen valleys and starlit caves, humanity was already learning its oldest lesson, that survival is never about purity, but about connection. When scientists look into our DNA today, they find echoes of those ancient encounters written deep within us. Every person of non-African ancestry carries about 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA, silent fragments inherited from unions that took place tens of thousands of years ago. These traces aren't just genetic curiosities, they are living evidence that Neanderthals didn't entirely vanish. They became part of us. Some of their genes still shape who we are. The Neanderthal legacy influences our immune system, helping early humans survive in colder climates filled with new diseases. It affects skin tone and hair color, even our body's response to sunlight. A few genes are connected to how we process fat, how we sleep, and how we adapt to temperature. In this way, their survival skills became ours, yet natural selection is ruthless. Over time, certain Neanderthal genes were filtered out, particularly those on the X chromosome, suggesting that male hybrids were less fertile. Evolution kept what helped us and erased what harmed us, turning interbreeding into a quiet partnership of adaptation. Genetically, the closeness between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals is staggering. We share more than 99.7% of our DNA, almost identical, separated by only a few million molecular letters out of 3 billion. To put that in perspective, we differ from chimpanzees by roughly 30 to 50 million base pairs. The difference between us and them is smaller than the difference between shades of the same color. And yet, within that tiny fraction of difference lies everything that makes us modern humans: language, creativity, and abstract thought. Scientists have discovered that only about 7% of our genome is truly unique to Homo sapiens, and an even smaller portion, about 1.5%, is shared by all humans alive today. Those few strands are linked to brain development and cognition, the spark that may have driven art, culture, and imagination. So when we talk about Neanderthals, we are not speaking of strangers. Their bloodline flows quietly within our own. They are not extinct. They are remembered in the rhythm of our hearts, in the resilience of our bodies, and in the shared story written in our cells. To understand the Neanderthals, we must look beyond their bones and see the lives they actually lived. For centuries, they were portrayed as brutish cave dwellers, hunched, primitive, and doomed to fail. But every discovery made in the past few decades has shattered that image. Far from mindless savages, Neanderthals were intelligent, emotional beings who built a world of their own, one that in many ways mirrored ours. They mastered their harsh Ice Age environment with resilience and creativity. In the frozen valleys of Europe, small family groups of 10 to 15 members hunted massive animals, mammoths, bison, and reindeer using stone-tipped spears, crafted with precision. They made clothing from animal hides, sewed with bone needles, and sought shelter in caves or huts made of wood and tusks. Around their fires, they roasted meat, shared warmth, and likely shared stories too. Archaeologists have found necklaces made from shells and teeth, pigments used as body paint, and traces of symbols carved into rock walls long before Homo sapiens arrived. These discoveries reveal minds capable of beauty and meaning, people who not only survived, but expressed themselves. They cared for their sick and elderly, tended the wounded, and buried their dead with tenderness. In one grave, the remains of a child were found surrounded by flowers, a gesture of love that transcends time. Their brains were slightly larger than ours, suggesting not greater intelligence, but a different kind of thinking, one shaped by cooperation, empathy, and endurance. They may have spoken, sung, or whispered to one another in ways we will never fully know. Some scientists believe their voices were deeper, resonant, perhaps filled with the same wonder and longing that still define us today. So when we picture them, we should not see monsters in furs, but people, our cousins, facing the same fears, hopes, and dreams. They laughed, they mourned, they looked up at the same stars and wondered what lay beyond. In them, we glimpse an ancient reflection of ourselves, a reminder that humanity did not begin with us, it began with all of them. For thousands of years, Neanderthals and Homo sapiens shared the same continent. They hunted the same animals, drank from the same rivers, and watched the same northern skies. And then, around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals were gone. No great disaster, no sudden extinction, just silence. So what really happened? The truth is that no single cause erased them. It was a slow unraveling, a combination of pressures that gradually pushed them to the edge. First came the climate. The Ice Age was a brutal and unpredictable master. Temperatures swung wildly, shifting from freezing cold to brief warmth and back again. Forests vanished, animals migrated, and Neanderthals were forced to follow their food across vast, empty lands. Every change demanded adaptation, but each adaptation came with a cost. Then there was isolation. The total Neanderthal population may never have exceeded a few tens of thousands across all of Eurasia. They lived in small groups, sometimes no more than 15 people, scattered and separated by mountains and glaciers. Such tiny communities were fragile. A harsh winter, a disease, or the loss of a few hunters could wipe out a lineage forever. Without a wide network to exchange mates or ideas, their genetic and cultural diversity shrank, generation after generation. And finally, competition arrived in the form of us Homo sapiens. When our ancestors entered Europe about 50,000 years ago, they came in larger groups with new tools, broader social networks, and the ability to adapt quickly. They painted, planned, and organized in ways that allowed them to thrive in shifting climates. In some places, they coexisted peacefully with Neanderthals. In others, they may have competed for land and prey. Over time, the balance tipped. Some Neanderthals merged into our communities through interbreeding. Others faded away, their lines ending quietly in forgotten valleys. Scientists call this introgressive extinction, a vanishing through absorption. Neanderthals didn't simply die out, they were woven into us, strand by strand, until they no longer existed as a separate people. Their extinction wasn't an explosion, it was an echo. But perhaps the greatest lesson of their story is that extinction doesn't always announce itself. The Neanderthals didn't know they were disappearing. They were simply living, raising children, surviving winters, lighting fires against the dark, unaware that the world was changing faster than they could endure. And that's where their story becomes ours. Because we, too, live in a time of great change, of shifting climates, fragile populations, and uncertain futures. Like them, we face choices that will decide whether we endure or fade. The difference is, we can see it coming. The fall of the Neanderthals is not a tragedy of weakness. It's a mirror of what happens when adaptability, cooperation, and foresight fail. They teach us that survival is never guaranteed, that every generation must earn it anew. If we forget that lesson, we might one day join them not as enemies, but as echoes of what once was. So, did the Neanderthals truly vanish? In a way, yes, their name, their separate existence, their world of ice and stone are long gone. But in another, deeper sense, they endure. They live on in the smallest details of who we are, in our genes, in our resilience, in the spark that drives us to create, explore, and survive. Every heartbeat, every breath, carries a whisper of them. The Neanderthals were not our failures or our opposites. They were another version of what humanity could be: strong, empathetic, intelligent, and deeply human. Their story reminds us that evolution is not a race toward perfection, but a constant negotiation with change. Sometimes, survival means becoming something new. Sometimes, it means being absorbed into something greater. Their disappearance wasn't a defeat. It was a transformation. But if their extinction was gradual and unrecognized, it raises a haunting question: could the same happen to us? As we change our planet, build our machines, and spread beyond Earth, will we still be the same species in 100,000 years? Or will we too dissolve into something else, remembered only through fragments of DNA and stories in the dust? Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Neanderthals, a reminder that existence is fragile and the future is never promised. Yet, within that fragility lies hope, because unlike them, we can choose our fate. We can look beyond our single planet, beyond our brief moment in time. We can endure, not as relics, but as builders of worlds. Mars, perhaps, may be our last chance saloon, but the spirit that carried us out of Africa, that faced the cold and the unknown, still burns, and as long as it does, humanity's story is not yet finished.